So I left medicine because I wanted to try investment banking, and it really wasn't a decision to leave medicine forever. What I wanted to do was make sure that in my lifetime I tried as many different things as possible that I was interested in. So when I got a job in a hospital called John Hopkins in Oxford, I actually sat down with the surgeon who was in charge of the firm I was going to work for, who happened to be a woman, and we talked about it, and she agreed with me 100% that it's really easy to get stuck in a silo and never do anything else, particularly in medicine. So I went off to Goldman Sachs thinking I would just stay for a year and then probably come back to the hospital, and I loved investment banking. And I ended up staying there for 3 years. And then I had the same sort of crisis of conscience when I decided to leave Goldman and go to business school to do my MBA. I remember about 2 weeks before I was due to leave, I sat down with the partner in charge of the group I was working for and had a similar sort of conversation and came to the same sort of conclusion that, it was worthwhile just trying something new, and you could, pick up a lot of skills and a lot of softer skills, because everything I'd done in my life up until that point, whether it was medicine or banking, had actually been quite technically focused. And I was going to Stanford Business School, which has the technical aspect, but is also quite famous for touching on softer skills and preparing you for any life event that you might encounter. So I went off to Stanford for 2 years, and that proved to be one of the best decisions I ever made. I think from a professional perspective, what it gave me was the confidence to know that no matter what I did after business school, whether I went into an entrepreneurial field or I went into non-profit, I'd always be able to make a living. So I think I've got quite an independent streak. So having that grounding to say, well, I can always find a job somewhere was, it gives you confidence, or it gave me confidence to try a lot of different things. And then from a personal level, the type of MBA you get at Stanford really does prepare you for life in the business world and outside of the business world. And it really teaches you a lot about yourself and softer skills and things. So it was a really great experience. And after business school, I then moved back to Nigeria and started. At first, I wasn't working full time in the business I'm a managing director of now. I just sort of joined at an early stage to help with the business model they needed to put together. And it was their first business model, really. And so I put that together for them, and in the course of doing that, learned about the business and really caught the bug, and I've been there ever since. So Ladol is an industrial free zone. It's actually the name of a place rather than a specific company. And similar to free zones across the world, what we try and do is create an ecosystem which is designed to support certain types of activities which would not otherwise be possible in the country for various reasons. So Nigeria is a high-growth, developing market, and we have a lot of problems that you find in markets like that: infrastructural issues, slow bureaucratic processing, and so on. At the same time, we have a huge unaddressed market. We've got a population of 180 million. We spend about $20 billion a year on oil and gas. We spend probably 100 billion, don't quote me on that because I'm not sure of the number, but we spend large amounts of money on imports every year. So there's a huge market that isn't being met by local manufacturing and local resources. So it really makes sense in a market like that to build a free zone where you can address the infrastructural issues, you can address the power issues, you can address the human resource issues, you can shorten the timeline for bureaucratic processing because everything is done in one place. So in other words, Ladol is like an industrial town which is built specifically to enable large manufacturing and industrial projects to take place in Nigeria in this small area while the rest of the country catches up, if you like. And that's worked. That's a similar sort of model that they used in China at the start of their current growth. And Brazil to a certain extent did something similar, but it's a really, really smart way of enabling the country to become industrialized while with the help of the private sector, while the government can focus on building out the infrastructure and services in the rest of the country. So in order to build Ladol, we initially focused our business model on the oil and gas sector, because that's a sector that enables you to raise a lot of capital for large infrastructure developments. For example, we've now got the largest shipyard in West Africa built inside Ladol in order to service an oil and gas project. However, once the infrastructure is built, you can use it for any heavy industrial operation. So this same shipyard has the largest crane capacity in Africa, and we can use that for building ships for in any kind of industrial process. We can use it for fishing, we can use it for building containers, for imports and exports, and we can also use it for building aeroplanes, for building railways. So once the facility is built, you can use it for lots of things, but it's really hard to raise money on the basis of a very diffuse business plan. It's really hard to raise money anyway, but to raise money for a specific oil and gas project is probably the most feasible way to do it. I think it's fair to say that in order for West Africa to succeed, Nigeria must succeed. I think that's fair to say. I think that Nigeria has a much better chance of succeeding in the next 20 years than any other country in West Africa for two reasons. One is because we have enough money inside Nigeria to fund enough development to get to the point where there are areas into which foreign capital can flow. So if you look at the analogy of China again, it wouldn't have made sense for GE to just land in China in the middle of a village, set up a factory and start building cars. The Chinese first had to invest. They had to build up areas which GE could then come to and invest in and set up their factories. And that's exactly what we're doing in Nigeria. So we have enough capital as Nigerians to get to the point where foreign investment can then start to come in and you reach that virtuous cycle. And I think in terms of the rest of Africa, the success of Nigeria, which will lead to the success of West Africa, will definitely ensure that the rest of Africa is developed quicker. And I think if you look at the East Coast, if you look at Eastern African countries, particularly Kenya, they're going through their own industrial revolution. They're going through their own metamorphosis at the same time that Nigeria is going in. So I don't think you could say that Kenya's success depends on Nigeria, but the impact that Nigeria has on the region it's in, Sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, is far greater, I think, than any single country has on any other region in Africa. I don't think that Ladol is solely responsible for Nigeria's industrialization. I think Ladol is the most high-profile example of a new type of investment that needs to take place in Nigeria, and that's namely the indigenous private sector. Historically, Nigeria's infrastructure, everything really has been funded by the government. And that business model is fraught with moral hazard, to put it mildly. And it's now resulted in a situation where we have about an $8 billion infrastructure gap every year. Only 18% of our roads are paved, and so on and so on. And there are lots of reasons for that, and there's no point in apportioning blame. It's not really the fault of any specific Nigerian government. Equally, I don't blame the international community. I think the whole world has now changed. If you look at, the most developed country in the world, America is also talking about having an infrastructure gap. They're also talking about having challenges addressing these issues. So what I would think is that the global economy has changed such that governments are no longer best placed to make these investments. We are in a fortunate position in high-growth countries like Nigeria, where we have a thriving private sector that needs to redeploy its capital in terms of investing in long-term, medium to long-term infrastructure developments and resource developments and human capital developments. And we're fortunate that we have the capital to do that, and that we're doing it at a time where there's a lot of technology available, there's a lot of knowledge out there. So when we were building Ladol, we didn't have to be that smart, to be honest with you. We went around the world and we saw what worked in other places. A lot of the industries that we're supporting are highly predictable. the outcome of those industries, so for example, if you're building a car, at the end of the day you're going to have a car, haven't changed significantly, but the methodologies have changed. There's been a lot of learning in everything from the technology to design the car, to put the car together, how to manage your personnel, how best to make sure that the benefits from the company are actually translated into benefits for the whole of society. So there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of knowledge out there. And we can use that as the private sector to make sure that the investments we're making are optimal in terms of the returns to our shareholders. So we've got to buy the right technology, we've got to buy the right machinery, we've got to build the right industrial free zone. And we can also make sure there's maximal benefit to the country. And there's a strong business rationale for us to do that as private sector, because the better the education system, the better the healthcare system, the better the quality of life that my workers have, the better the outcome for the company. The really fantastic thing I found in being in Ladol is that the benefits you get, like all these things that I'm talking about, you can actually see it within a 5-year period. These are not things that take generations to materialize. Nigeria is such a huge market. There are so many areas where the market is not addressed by local infrastructure or local businesses, that if you do build a business that can address that market need, whether it be oil and gas logistics, which is one of the other areas we're in, or it's something like manufacturing telephone handsets, you will see the results immediately. So this is something that is really important. We believe very strongly in the mission and vision. We believe really strongly in collaboration now and getting as many other businesses and many other individuals as possible to make these long-term investments in infrastructure. So we do take that mission seriously, but I wouldn't be so, bold as to say that, it's all resting on our shoulders. I think there are a lot of other people who are thinking in the same direction. And to the extent that we're setting an example which encourages more and more people to do that, and which encourages the international community to support companies like Ladol, the better for everybody. For us, having a clear mission and vision is key. Key is too weak a word. Over the past decade, when we've been building Ladol, we have fought an uphill battle. And we have had to surmount so many hurdles that it would have been impossible to do that if we didn't have a clear mission and vision. I'm hoping that the next facility that comes up, the other businesses that come up with a similar mission and vision, have an easier time of it, because otherwise it will take too long for Nigeria to get to where it needs to get to. But knowing from inception that we were building an industrial free zone to industrialize Nigeria and make it the hub for West Africa, that we were going to start by targeting the offshore oil and gas market, that we needed to build a facility that would be efficient and that would lower costs. Bearing that in mind throughout this 10-year trek, if you like, has been instrumental in enabling us to get to the end result that we're seeing now. And I do think that it's something which gets thrown around a lot and that people don't appreciate the importance of, because, of course, by the time you hear about a company's mission and vision, quite often that company's already a success. And Ladol still has a long way to go, but if people were to look at us even at this stage, I don't think they would appreciate what we've been through. And so you sometimes think that that company has just kind of conveniently come up with this mission and vision yesterday. But if you look at it, you will find that most companies that are really successful, even a Microsoft or a Facebook, they started off with a mission and vision when it was just a couple of people sitting around a desk. And they put it on the wall and they lived that for years and years, sometimes decades. And that's what drove them towards their success, because that level of focus is required when you're trying to do something that is disruptive or unique, that challenges the status quo in any way. And when you're trying to do all of those things in an emerging market, it is particularly challenging. My advice to female leaders, or to females in the workplace in general, is firstly to bear in mind that sexism is real, and a lot of people don't even understand the ways in which they're being sexist. So you do have the egregious examples, you know, where a very junior person is taken advantage of by a very senior person, and it's clearly wrong. But what can sometimes be more frustrating and more damaging, particularly as you move up your career path, is when you don't get that promotion and it's not really clear why you haven't got that promotion, or, you know, the jobs that you're getting assigned are challenging but they're not really pushing you, or you find yourself in a team situation and you know that you're always kind of coming up with the solutions but you're not being rewarded for that. And that's the type of sexism where if you speak up, you even feel like, well, I'm not really sure what's going on here. I'm not really sure whether this is sexism or not. But what underlies this is the fact that we're all brought up, men and women, in every culture in the world, really, with certain stereotypes. And it's really hard to break out of those stereotypes. And what you find in all the studies that have been done on this, on the one hand, for example, if you look at startups, they found that if a startup has a woman as one of the founders, it's 60% more likely to be successful. Now, I don't know if they looked at all the correlations on that or anything, but clearly having a woman involved is enormously important. Similarly, we all accept now that having women on the board or having diversity on the board actually adds to your bottom line. And when I was at Goldman, they actually started tying the compensation that partners got to the level of diversity in their teams. And that's because there is actually a monetary value to the company. So on the one hand, we know that there's value in this, and on the other hand, you don't see women getting to the top. And I think a lot of the reason women don't get to the top is this sort of subliminal sexism that's hard to put your finger on, but that leads to a lot of women kind of being stuck midway through their careers. And some of it has to do with women going and having babies and things like that, but it's more than that. So my advice to women is, number one, be aware that this is a real thing. It's not just in your head. It's actually a real thing. Statistically, you know, women entrepreneurs get less funding. Women are viewed as being less competent than men, all things being equal. These are still factors which are part of our reality. So I think accept it that that is part of the reality, and then figure out how to overcome it. And the only foolproof way of overcoming it is to work harder and to be present, to work harder, and to deliver on a very consistent basis, and to be strategic. It is not going to be the case that as a woman you're going to be handed a leadership role. That's highly unlikely to happen. It's more likely that you're going to have to, you know, come up with an idea that no one has come up with before, that you're going to have to work harder to impress, that you're going to have to lead your team through a crisis and therefore emerge as the leader of that team. And unfortunately, until there are enough women at the top, it's not going to be possible for women to get to the top except by, to a greater or lesser extent, being extraordinary. And so the message is really, don't expect to be patted on the back or to be rewarded unless you've done something that really makes you stand out. So you've got to work really hard. And I think that's an important message because, you know, too often, you know, in today's society, people think, okay, the battle's been won. Now we're going to, you know, now we have laws, so everything's going to be equal. And unfortunately, you know, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way in terms of race, and it doesn't work that way in terms of sex. The battle hasn't been won, which means you still have to outperform in order to get what you're entitled to. So I think when you try to figure out the problems underlying sexism or lack of equality for women in the workplace, it's really hard to put your finger on it. The issue of role models, though, is critically important. It's important for diversity in general. There's a guy called Malcolm Gladwell that wrote a book called Blink. And in this book, he actually, you know, brought out a scientific experiment that shows basically that we all have social biases. And those social biases are largely influenced by our environment, by what we see, by what we read in the news. So, for example, the fact that, you know, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister here and that Hillary Clinton may be president in the US will have a huge influence on women growing up now in terms of what they think they can be when they grow up. But on a day-to-day basis, you get a lot of other social cues which put women in a negative role. So, if you look at James Bond movies, women are still, women in those movies haven't come as far as one would perhaps like them to have come. It's an improvement. It's definitely an improvement on where we were 20 years ago, but you still have these sexual stereotypes which basically have women depicted as being unfulfilled if they don't have a man in their lives, being unfulfilled if they don't get married. So your wedding day for a woman is still the happiest day of your life. Men are still depicted as being trapped by women. Women in the workplace who are overly ambitious are still depicted in a negative way. One of the main criticisms of Hillary Clinton is that she's ambitious. Whereas her opponent, who is a man who shall remain nameless, is depicted as in a positive way for having, lifetime's ambition to be a billionaire. And there's no way a woman could get away with that. So you do have these stereotypes that are really strongly prevalent. And one of the most powerful ways to overcome those stereotypes is to have positive role models of women succeeding, of women being independent, of women leading happy, productive, independent lives. And I definitely think that Hollywood, has a role to play. And over the past 30 years, Hollywood has improved, but, they still have a long way to go. On the other hand, you then get what I think is a bit of a myth, which is that women are pulling each other down and women aren't supporting women. So my take on that is the following. One, particularly when you get to the top, there aren't that many women around. And typically, if I'm at a meeting and there's only 3 women there, like I was at a conference this week, and I think there are about 3 women in the room, there was no animosity, far from it. We actually, all ended up at one point in the day or another meeting and swapping stories and talking. So this idea that because there are only a few women in the top positions, that there's only a few slots for women, I think is largely a myth. Everybody recognizes now that you want to get more women up there. And so it's not the case that there's only one slot for a woman and you're the token woman, which maybe was what things seemed like in the 80s. I think now we've moved on from that. So my personal experience is that it's not true that women sabotage each other. It is true that there just aren't many women around. It is true that there aren't enough ways in which women can socialize and help each other. So you have, men playing golf. You have that stereotype, although I know a lot of men don't play golf. But even aside from the stereotypes, there are a lot of ways in which men can socialize and help each other. And one of the problems you have if you're a woman in a senior position is, you may be able to go to the pub or you may be able to go for drinks, but you can't stay out till 3 a.m. carousing with the boys and still be respected, the next day when you go into the office. Women have to walk a very fine line. So those social interactions where men can bond are not really available for women. And so I think there is a need for women to find ways to support each other outside of the office. And, I definitely encourage societies and groups where women can get together and share stories and share best practice, because for a woman to succeed and to get to the top of any industry, she needs to excel. And it's a lot easier to excel if you have, help doing that. So sustainability is very close to my heart, and it's something which Ladol has taken, or the company that I work for has also taken on board. Personally, I joined the board of the Global Business Sustainability Commission last year. And that commission is designed to enable private sector to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which replaced the Millennium Development Goals in 2015. Now, I had mixed feelings about the Millennium Development Goals. I felt that there was too much of, in the developed world, imposing on developing world criteria which may or may not make sense depending on what country you are in. And at the end by the end of 2015, it was apparent that the Millennium Development Goals had only been achieved because of Brazil and China, 2 countries which had largely ignored them. and had not developed in line with those goals at all, really. However, the nice thing, or the clever thing that the UN did was take this on board, and in the next iteration, which are the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN has created a set of goals and targets, I think 17 goals and 164 targets, which, number one, apply to the whole world. So this distinction between developed and developing is now gone. There's a recognition that all countries in the world, no matter what stage their economy is at, have work to do. The second thing is they've put in place a framework which was designed by the countries of the world. It wasn't imposed on anybody. This was something which all the countries in the world had a say on, and that's why there are so many of them. But if you look at them and you apply them, for example, to a country like Nigeria, it's a really good template for us. We've just gotten a new government which has completely changed the way governance, or is in the midst of changing the way Nigeria is governed. So to have these sustainable development goals come along at this particular time in Nigeria's history is actually ideal, because they are a very practical framework that can be applied across all our ministries, across all the areas of government, and more importantly, in terms of my personal belief, they can also be driven by private sector. So even in areas like education, you could see how private sector could invest in education and could not supplant the role of government and not take over what government is supposed to do, but could monitor what government does, could encourage what government does, could empower parents to make sure that if government is supposed to pay for 100 books for, level 3 in a village, that those 100 books arrive, and if those 100 books arrive, they can give the parents the information they need to go find out why those 100 books haven't arrived. So everything from empowering civil society to driving large projects like Ladol are within the framework of Sustainable Development Goals. So the commission I'm working on is putting together a report which is going to define areas that private sector can make money from, while at the same time helping to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's something which is a complete departure for the development community because there's always been this feeling within the development community that making money is bad and that business is evil. But I think now there's a realization that that may not be the case, and that you actually need to meet in the middle, because business is inevitable. We live in a capitalist society. People are going to make money. And a lot of the wealth of the world is now in private hands. So if you're going to change the world, and if you're going to succeed in Sustainable Development Goals, there needs to be a meeting of the minds. And also, I think business is a great enabler of change. If you show how by investing in a car manufacturing plant in Nigeria, you're going to make a 25% return for your shareholders, you're going to employ 3,000 Nigerians, and that's going to lead to helping to add to a middle class which could potentially go up to 100 million people. You've now got 100 million people joining the middle class, which is going to drive the global economy, and so on and so on. There are a lot of positives that can come out of this. So it creates a win-win-win. And I think as a world, we need to move away from thinking, which capitalism unfortunately does encourage, but does not necessarily represent true capitalism. But historically, we've been thinking in terms of win-lose. So, in the 80s, you go into a negotiation and one person comes out a winner and one person comes out a loser. I think now people are thinking differently. Like, for me, the heart of the new economy is creating a situation where we're all winners. And it is clear now that if one person comes out of the room with $99 and another person comes out with $1, even the person who's got the $99 is a loser. Because what are you going to do with that money? What are you going to do with that business? Who's your client going to be? So in order to be, for it to be a win-win, there has to be some level of equality. There has to be, everybody has to have enough to live on. And I think there is a recognition, even in the most right-wing, staunch kind of Ayn Rand, objectivist strongholds, that we've moved too far in the direction of inequality, we've moved too far from sustainability, and we need to move back to the middle. And business is a fantastic way of doing that, particularly when there's a strong economic rationale for doing so. And that's why I got involved with the Commission, and I'm excited about the work the Commission is doing, because once you show business the way, you show them how they can tap into this, $180 million market in Nigeria, I think the market will take over. My views on globalization are that we haven't achieved it yet. So I'm always a little bit surprised when people are blaming globalization for the problems we have. For globalization to be real, you have to actually remove all the artificial props that are still protecting, for example, agricultural exports from Europe and America to the tune of billions of dollars a week. And until you remove those props, you don't have globalization. The reason you can't remove those props, though, is because all countries are not equal. So another reason I don't think we've achieved globalization is that, in my mind, for globalization to work, everybody sitting around the table has to be treated as an equal. If they aren't, then that isn't a global economy. That's basically a continuation of a sort of a pseudo-colonialism. It's a power play. We're still doing what we were doing 50 years ago. We're just calling it something different. And the interconnectedness that people think represents globalization, to me, is just technology. So we've got great technology, but underlying that technology has to be a business philosophy or a mission or a policy that supports a level of equality, that creates a level playing field, that then says, okay, so, Britain, in addition to producing fantastic Olympic athletes, you're also really good at developing a service culture. You have the best technology in this, so we're going to come to you for that. Nigeria, you've got, great natural resources, you've got palm oil, you've got coca, and you've got a bit of oil and gas, so we're going to come to you for that, but we want you to actually do something with it before you give it to us, and so forth. So all the countries of the world have something to add to the table, but if you keep propping up economies that should have moved on, so, if you look at a country like Denmark, which is at the forefront of sustainability and arguably at the forefront of renewable energies. That's great, but it's Denmark. Imagine where the world would be if America had done what Denmark has done. If instead of clinging to manufacturing and protecting industries which really would be better served, like agriculture, if they were done outside of the States, they had thrown themselves into pushing the boundaries of technology, educating their young people so that they could lead the world with technologies and so forth, imagine where the world would be. So for me, globalization is something which we're still working on. I think that in order for us to get there, we Nigerians need to focus on getting our country to the point where we can demand a seat at the table on a level of equality. Because nobody's going to give us that. Nobody's going to just turn around and say, well, because we think that would be a good thing for Nigeria to be part of the global economy, we're going to give you a seat and we're going to build it for you and clean it up. And, so nobody's going to do that. And it doesn't even make sense for them to do that. And it is suboptimal if they do it. The optimal thing is for us to figure out how can we add value to the world and then get on and do it. So each country, I think, has to figure out for themselves how they fit into the global economy and how they get a seat at the table. And they need to do what China has done, which is figure out a way to develop their country, initially using their local resources, subsequently attracting in foreign resources to help, and get their economies to the point where they can demand a seat at that table. And when enough countries have done that, then we can talk about globalization. Right now, we're just all talking to each other, every 10 seconds on Twitter. That's not globalization. So for me, doing an MBA was a difficult choice, primarily because I'd already had a lot of education. So I was in, medical school for 6 years. And, then I was in investment banking where you get, quite a lot of training as well. So I felt like I'd spent a lot of my time being educated. And I wasn't sure, it was really fair of me to take out another 2 years to be more educated. So because of the background I'd had, I wanted to choose a school that would give me a unique experience, unique to my life. And for me, Stanford was it. I probably wouldn't have gone to business school if I hadn't gotten into Stanford, because I wanted to be in an environment that was taking me completely out of my comfort zone, that was quite entrepreneurial, and most importantly for me was focused on enabling people to achieve their full potential without any judgment. So it wasn't about just getting straight A's in 10 subjects, whether you cared about those subjects or not. It was about focusing on 1 or 2 things that you really cared about and doing everything you could to learn about those subjects. It was about failing and succeeding and learning from failing and not being worried about, whether you got a grade at all. So being in that kind of environment was exactly what I was looking for. Now, the MBA also gave me a platform which I felt I could rely on for the rest of my life to get a job. So for me, it was important to go to a school that was internationally recognized, just so the money I'd invested was going towards a qualification that would be universally accepted, so that if, 10 years after the MBA, I wanted to get a job in California or I wanted to get a job in Bangladesh, I could. That's something that people would look at your CV and say, okay, if you got this MBA, you're fit for purpose. And I think it also suited me because I'm someone who's interested in lots of things. Maybe that's why managing Ladol suits me, because Ladol is like a village. So we do so many different, there are so many different aspects to my job, from building and construction to negotiating with oil companies to handling human relations, of so many different characters within the free zone. So being in a place where I could, be out of my comfort zone a little bit and meet with lots of different types of people. I mean, the class is small, but very, very diverse. Diverse in terms of background. So you've got your classic private equity New York guys who all stick together and they wear polo shirts and they play golf, for real, very stereotypical. And then you've got, your non-profit, cares about humanity, stands up in class and, gets petitions for whatever natural disasters go. So you've got those people. And then the nice thing is not just that you've got them in the class, but that they're really sincere. They're not doing this for any other reason than that this is something they're passionate about. So I think, and obviously you get the learning as well. I mean, the classes are important. So you do have your we do have compulsory maths and finance classes and everything. So Stanford is a place of formal learning as well. So putting all those things together, for me, I had, the ideal MBA experience. And so my advice would really be for everybody who's thinking about an MBA to go through the same process and figuring out what their ideal experience is. And if it is to spend a year at INSEAD, then that's what you should do, because you're not doing this for anybody other than yourself. And this may be the last thing and the most indulgent thing you do for yourself. And so, embrace that and really figure out what is the ideal MBA scenario for me. And go for it 100%, and don't, give it your all, because whether you get into the school you want to get into, or you think you want to get into, and then you get into another school and you go look at it and you think, wow, this place is fantastic. When I went to Stanford, I just knew this was, you feel very comfortable. And I went to a few other schools and looked around as well, but definitely when I went to Stanford, I felt very comfortable that this is where I want to be. So when you get that feeling and you feel strongly and intuitively that this is a place that's going to tick all your boxes, I think life is long, and that it's better to live without any regrets. And if you feel that passionately about the MBA, you should definitely go for it. On the other hand, if you're a very practical person and you're trying to change careers, you're trying to get into banking or you're trying to get into consulting, an MBA is a stepping stone to doing that. And there are some shorter MBAs you can take that will allow you to get that stepping stone. So it can also be just a very practical tool for switching careers. And during a down market is usually a good time, to take on board more qualifications so that when the market starts to pick up, you're at the top of the pile. So am I optimistic about the world at large? I'm always optimistic about the world, because if you look at where we've come from in the last 1,000, even 100 years, we've come a long way. Like in 1939, Europe, was going into a horrendous period of destruction of lives and property. And now, less than 100 years later, look where the world is. So I'm always optimistic about the way the world is going. And I think that, unfortunately, we're going through a period where bad news is more popular than good news, and so it can seem like things are getting worse. But if you look at even things like crime rates, crime in London today is less than it was 10 years ago. But that just doesn't get reported. You just see the year on year, and usually you just even see the number that, 10 people were killed last week, and that sounds like a lot, but it's less than the number of people who were killed before. So generally, I think society is trending in the right direction. What worries me is how quickly we're going to get there and the bumps along the way. And, I don't want to trivialize the horrible things that are happening around the world right now by using that phrase, bumps along the way. But I do want to highlight the fact that these are changes that sometimes we need to go through, because society is controlled by a small number of people. And practically speaking, in some parts of the world, these people have an extraordinary amount of control. So in other words, you're not dealing with democracies. Although I don't know if anywhere in the world we have real democracies at the moment. But, in these countries, you're really not dealing with democracies. And so in order to go through the crucible, to get to the point where the government is acting in the interests of the people and, business is acting responsibly and in line with the law, it's not going to be easy. And in some countries, you're going to have, horrific war and destruction before you get there. So what worries me is, how much suffering do we have to go through before we get to the point where societies are productive and healthy and people can be safe. The Middle East is going through a terrible time right now, but even in parts of Africa where there aren't wars, people are going through a terrible time, and a lot of that is man-made. And so how do we get to the point where these things are not happening, or are happening less frequently, or are happening for less long? That's the kind of thing that worries me. But overall, I think we're all going to come out better and stronger and happier. I just wish, we didn't have to suffer so much along the way, and I wish we would get there quicker. In terms of Nigeria specifically, I think Nigeria is on the right path. Nigeria right now is at a crossroads, though, very much so. We have a new government that is focused on law and order. They're coming under a bit of criticism right now because we also live in a society that's very short term and that's very driven by politicians who make unrealistic promises on the one hand, and populations who, for some reason that I can't fathom, believe those promises. So I think the government we have in Nigeria has been quite clear about the fact that there's going to be suffering, that it was going to be really hard for them to turn the economy around and get us back on track, if you like. But unfortunately, there's a lot of impatience that's coming up with that. And that's why I think we're at a crossroads, because we need to give the government time to fix these problems. And there's no easy, painless way to fix those problems. And so the issue is, will they be able to keep people calm? Will they be able to get people to be patient while they put the new policies in place, while they restore the rule of law, particularly when it comes to business practices? or not. So we are at a crossroads, but definitely I think if you look at Nigeria 5 years from now, we will be a thriving country because of the pain that we're going through right now, because it had to happen. We were, the rent-seeking in Nigeria, the rent-seeking economy was bigger than the real private sector economy. And that is clearly unsustainable. And it just happens to have all come to a head under this government. But because of the policies they're putting in place now, 5 years from now, we're going to be in a much different place, particularly since I don't think that people are necessarily good or bad. I think people do what is in their interest. And very few people go out of their way to be bad, and most people I think are reluctant to be bad, even if it's their interest to do so. So I think under a government and with a society that enables you to make the right choice, which is what we're building in Nigeria right now, I think the vast majority of people will make the right choice, because most people just want to do their work, they want to go home, they want to be with their family, they want to hang out with their friends. That's what most people want. So if you give them the opportunity to do that, that's what they'll do. I think the challenges that we're going to face as Ladol are huge, but they always have been. So we are building an industrial free zone. We are building a new business model in a country and in a region where private sector is often viewed with suspicion. We're viewed with suspicion we were viewed with suspicion by previous governments, because this idea that private sector people would invest their own money in the long term was very unusual and disruptive. It's disruptive because it highlights the issues and the economic damage done by companies that use government money instead of their own money to do this. And it makes it clear that some of the practices that the pseudo-private sector and the government friends they had were engaging in were undermining our economy. So because of that level of disruption, and because of the level of transparency we brought to the market, historically we have had a lot of problems with Nigerian companies and with international companies, because obviously all this work that isn't being done in Nigeria is being done by certain international companies. And those international companies weren't too happy when they found that, there's a Nigerian company that could do it in Nigeria. So the disruption caused friction, and it made it really hard for us to get to the point that we're at now. The point that we're at now, though, is creating a lot of positive opportunities for us, because interests are now aligned. Because it turns out that once you show people that you can manufacture locally, for example, with the logistics business, so we support offshore oil and gas logistics, and offshore oil and gas is really expensive to do. So you need what's known as a fully integrated base to do it. Fully integrated is what it says on the label, which is everything is in one place. It's really expensive to build because it means you have to build the quay wall, so where the ship comes in, the warehouses, the workshops, the hotels, office, everything in one place. So it's expensive to set up, but once you set it up, it's really, really efficient for the oil companies. So as soon as we opened our doors, we were able to offer the oil and gas market a 50% reduction in their local costs. And there are obviously some people who aren't happy about this for all the reasons I mentioned. There's a lot of people who don't want the cost to be lower because they're making a margin on the cost. So the lower the cost is, the less money they make. But that was the past. The reality is now you're in an environment where actually you've proven to the skeptics that it's possible to get this kind of cost saving in Nigeria. The oil companies are spending less money. It's making Nigeria more competitive, which is attracting more investment into Nigeria. And you start to create a virtuous circle so that the rent seekers, if you like, and those in government who weren't supporting you before are now starting to support you because you're seeing the market grow. And this is exactly what happened in Brazil. Over a 10-year period, Brazil went from where Nigeria is now, which is 10 or 15% local content, so local activity in country, to about 70%. And that's one of the things that helped them become the 6th largest economy in the world. So Nigeria, we're just at the beginning of that phase now. Facilities like Ladol have proven that Nigeria can be competitive. which is creating an alignment of interests between ourselves and the people who were previously fighting us, and is changing the way people look at doing business in Nigeria and West Africa. So going forward, we're still going to have challenges. We're going to have challenges diversifying out of oil and gas, which is one of the areas that we're focusing on right now. We're going to have challenges recruiting people and training people, because to lower our costs, the 50% cost saving is even before we look at using local human capital. Once we now train Nigerians to do the jobs that foreigners are doing, you're looking at a 25% reduction in cost just from human capital and using our local resources. So the cost savings will keep coming and coming, provided that we can put in place training programs and we can keep pushing forward. So yes, we're at a point where we're high profile and we've achieved some of our objectives as far as infrastructure goes, but we still have a lot of work to do. We have more infrastructure to build, more people to train. We've got to raise, a couple of $1 billion. So we've got a lot more work to do, and
just a couple of billion.
Just a couple of $1 billion, exactly. So we need to raise a lot of money. But I'm really happy that we've at least managed to get to the point we're at now, where we can prove to the skeptics out there that it is possible for Nigerians to make these types of investments, that they should be working with credible companies in the Nigerian private sector, and that if they do, you create a new economy win-win scenario. I also think over the next 5 years, Ladol will be transformed because we're already speeding down this path of development and building out the free zone. I think in 5 years, we will have achieved a lot of the objectives that we have right now in terms of infrastructure on the ground. And I think the wider impact of that, though, is what will be really interesting for Nigeria over the next decade. I think we'll see that wider impact in terms of development of related industries. For example, now that we have the shipyard in Ladol, there's a lot more interest in building our steel industry. We used to have a thriving steel industry, but obviously if everything's being manufactured outside the country, there isn't much call for local steel manufacturing. So these things are just now starting to be discussed. And as industrial free zones like Ladol continue to grow, you'll see related industries also begin to develop. So for Ladol, I think we've got a lot of challenges, but in the next 5 years, I see us, being really at the top of our game. And in the next 10 years, I see Nigeria really standing out in the world in terms of the level of industrialization that we've achieved in such a short time, and starting to attract some serious foreign investment because of it.